Hi, and welcome to our following session, Partitioning Business Logic using NVOs for Automated C# Migration. Following is a little disclaimer about this session. Okay, so now let's take a look at the session agenda. First, we'll see a short introduction. Next, we'll see and understand about knowing what business logic to partition. Then we'll see how to eliminate recursive embedded SQL. We'll take a look into partitioning transactions using Web API calls and partitioning non-visual logic utilizing server-side non-visual objects or NVOs. Then group multiple server calls into one group call with NVOs. Here's a little information about myself and about my company. Okay, so now let's continue by looking into the focus of this session. First, we need to determine what business logic is. Well, it is a part of the program that encodes the real-world business rules that apply to business objects. So anything that has to do with your UI or UX is actually not necessarily business logic. Now, why do we need to partition business logic? It is very useful if you want to migrate your business logic to web APIs. It helps deal with several specific types of inefficient PowerBuilder coding practices. It helps thin out heavy apps. It reduces excessive server calls, amongst many others. Now, why NVOs? Encapsulating, partitioning, or refactoring business logic into non-visual objects is a good practice that helps group heavy code into easily migratable objects. By the way, this has been very good practice for PowerBuilder developers for a very long time. So it is considered a good coding practice because business logic is not mixed with UI, UX, or non-business specific or related code. So instead of trying to write heavy logic more efficiently or avoiding use of heavy logic, the simplest way is just to offload all that heavy logic to the application server or web API, which is designed to handle the most daunting tasks. The only catch is that only non-visual logic can be run at the application server. But this is actually a very common practice nowadays. Almost every interaction you see today on the application side or website is basically done with web APIs. So this takes us to another question. What business logic should I partition? Well, mainly there are three business logic that you might want to take to the web API. For example, complex non-visual events and functions, especially non-visual events and functions that contain dynamic SQL, cursor statements, store procedure calls, and other SQL statements. Any other validation of updated data, or a series of data computations or a complex data computation. Anything that is specific to the business logic, anything that is not necessarily part of the UI, the UX, or even, for example, you have a data window, you want to filter out the data window for any given reason. You don't actually need to do that on the web API. You can do that on the client application. Since that is something that is not necessarily business logic, that is something on the more on the presentation style, then that can be handled easily by the client app. So the main idea about this is putting all your business logic, everything related to the actual business, on the web API. That way your business logic is centralized and can be consumed by any other UI technology as well. So let's take a look at a real example about this. Notice on this we will see the original part or PowerScript code of an application function, and this function, you'll notice that what it is actually doing, it is trying to get some details from a data window, then managing some information from the database by doing a select, then updating a price, and then updated it directly on the database by using an update statement, an update SQL statement. And this is done on a cycle. But then after that, you use a SQL CA to make sure that everything went well. If not, then you roll back. This is the part 2 that's on the center of the screen. Now then we go into another cycle by retrieving the same data window and catching in every one of the product ID, the new price IDs or the new price values, and then selecting the quantity and multiplying everything, then retrieving. This is done on a cycle as well, 4 cycle. On part 3, that's on the right of your screen, you see how we update this using a SQL statement, checking the SQL CA. If everything went okay, then we can just commit. So now let's take a look at how to actually transform this or pass this into a non-visual object that can be easily migrated to a web API. Okay, so here we have the same code that has already been refactored. And you'll notice that on part 1 that's on the right of your screen, what happened is that we actually declared a URL variable. This already has a value for the server port number, the controller, and well, no, the controller we're setting up in here, it's items for the first one, and so forth. So then we would be doing the retrieval, but using the web service. So this is already offloading some of this business logic directly into the web API. Okay, so then what we will be doing is doing a 4 cycle, but to handle the information inside a data window. And then we would be submitting any changes that we have made to this application, and we would submit that to the web API itself. Now, as you will notice, we still have another cycle, but this cycle is very much reduced because it is actually doing some simple calculations that can be easily handled on the client side, and this is just setting up a new price. This can also be put onto the web API if you wanted to, but well, this just illustrates a simple thing that can easily be managed by the client application as well. So on the part 2, you'll notice that we have set up a new URL with the new controller orders and the method retrieve passing in an argument. So we are retrieving the second data window, and then we're catching the row count, setting the items as needed for the amount, and finally saving the changes. So this is how simple it is. Notice how many lines of code have been reduced in here. So now let's take a look at the next screen. Here we'll see the source code that has been actually transferred into the web API. So on the right you have the order service, on the left you have the item service. Notice how we have the retrieval method on the item service. That's the only thing we need right there. So this is actually declaring a data store, setting up the data context similar to the SQL CI object in PowerBuilder. Then we will be doing an items.retrieve. That's we are retrieving the data store. And finally, we will be returning the data store. So that's how simple it is for the second retrieve. For the first retrieval of this data window. So now let's take a look at the second one. You see order service on the right. So we have 2 methods right there. One is for the retrieval method. It's accepting an argument, the order ID, it's an integer, sets up a data store and passes in the data context, retrieves the data stores, and then returns it. So that's very simple, right? But what about the save changes? This is something similar to what we do in PowerBuilder by doing the update. So here we're actually returning an integer of the amount of rows that have been actually modified. So you'll see that we have the orders data store that we accepted on this service. We're adding the data context or the SQL CA object, basically the same, and returning the result from the update method right in here. So it's actually very simple, very similar to what we have in PowerBuilder. So partitioning transactions using web API calls. Well, the purpose of this approach is to actually offload this task from the client app. This reduces the amount of server calls by placing the transactions in the server and only expecting the result sets. Transaction NVOs can then be used by other apps too. So this actually thins out your client app and helps heavy calculations, all the heavy business logic be in the web API instead of the client app. Okay, so here we'll see an example of how to partition transactions using web API calls. So first, on the left side we see the original source code, then on the center we see the refactor source code. Now notice that we do actually have a select statement inside of for cycle. That is because this is actually something really simple that can be handled by the web API and also by the client app itself. But on the right you see the web API service. That's the one that's managing the call to a store procedure, and the store procedure is the one that's doing the heavy loading of this application. So let's take a look at how to actually migrate this NVO. Okay, so this applies to the next release, that would be Snap Develop 2019 R2. But in this release, you'll see that you can right click on the solution and then open PV Workspace. I will open one that I had previously opened before, and then click here and here, scroll down, and let's go to the window that I want to actually migrate this from. So we'll go to the events of this. So now let's look at the one, find the one that we want to actually migrate. Here it is. And if I right click in here, translate and open in editor, let's give it just a second. Notice how this actually is performing the call to the procedure for me, setting up the arguments and any parameter values that I want to pass to it. And this is done within this little example I just showed you in here. So I just copy and paste this, and I can just place it into my web API as I need it. So partitioning non-visual logic utilizing server-side non-visual objects. The main purpose of this approach is to offload these tasks from the client app. This makes the client app a lot thinner, and then non-visual logic NVOs can then be used by other apps too. So let's take a look at another example. Notice the original source code. This is a business logic right in here. And then we have the web API service that has already been translated from this NVO. And then we have the service continuation on the right side. So let me show you how this, I actually got this translated into my web API automatically. Okay, so for this I would be coming back into Snap Develop. I would close this one and I will open another one. That is because that's where my example resides in. So let me just open PV Workspace. See right in here. So this one has an example of some PowerScript that I actually want to migrate. So if I go scroll down over here, you see that I have the loops, and this one manages a lot of PowerScript source code. Well, let's just right click in here, translate and open in editor. Notice how all the translation has been done automatically, and that is because I actually did this and encapsulated everything and refactored everything into NVOs. So this is basic PowerScript syntax, and this is one of the great advantages, that all these calculations can be performed on the web API, offloading a lot of the heavy coding on the client app itself. Now, what about group multiple server calls into one group call with NVOs? Well, this approach reduces unnecessary server calls. It makes the client app thinner as well, and non-visual logic NVOs can then be used by other apps too. But what is the main idea about this? So for example, if you have a lot of constant calls, for example, to the application database, and that is inside a for loop or a do while or something, then you can, instead of calling them many times from the client into the server, you could offload this to the server. The server would be managing those calls, and since the database is most likely going to be residing there anyway, or if not, it might be on the same network, then it would reduce latency and would make these transactions a lot easier and faster. So then the client app don't have to handle all the communication between the client itself and the database transactions. This would also be done automatically for you with the web API. So this is one of the great advantages of grouping multiple server calls into groups of NVOs. If you would like to learn more about how to partition business logic, how to pass this into NVOs, and then finally how to migrate this into C# web APIs, then you can follow us on our website appeon.com, and you can find there the documentation section. In it we have a lot of valuable resourceful material for you to learn more about these topics. You can find these links in here as well. Okay, now that's it for this presentation, and don't forget to join us on community.appeon.com and our social media links. Thank you very much and have a good day.